So now onto the program that you've been waiting for. Today's Alumni College session, How Do We Finance the Transformation of Our Energy System, will run for about 75 minutes. Our speaker will be interviewed by the moderator for about 30 to 45 minutes, and then we'll have about 30 minutes for Q&A. It's my honor to introduce our speaker, Reid Capalino, class of 2007, and our moderator, Govind Nair, class of 1983. Reid is a Senior Vice President for Business Development with LS Power, an investment and operating company focused on power generation, electric transmission, and energy infrastructure. He majored in economics at Reid and wrote his thesis on energy intensity trends in North America. Previously, Reid served as Managing Director with Aligned Climate Capital and Principal with Aligned Intermediary. Both investment platforms focused on deploying capital into clean energy and related areas. Govind is an adjunct professor at the Department of Organizational Sciences at the George Washington University, former lead economist at the World Bank, and a Reid Career Alliance co-chair. He will introduce Reid and moderate the discussion and Q&A. Now I'm going to turn it over to Reid and Govind.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Amy, and good evening. I'm sorry, good evening from Cambridge, UK, where I find myself, and good morning to most of you in the Pacific Northwest, and good day to the rest of you wherever you might be. It really is my honor and pleasure to moderate this event, and I'd like to get straight to it. Reid, it's very timely that we have the benefit of your expertise on this topic, because many of us in the last couple of weeks have become somewhat re-energized with the energy transition agenda, as we see, for example, shareholder activism perhaps taking some root in some major energy companies, two of them in the US, one in Europe. We've had a major turnaround this year in US energy policy with the change in administration. We have some very interesting developments in the economics of renewables versus fossil fuels. All these are interesting topics. We're going to talk about these hopefully and many others. But before we get into that, I'd like to talk a little bit, or I'd like you to talk a little bit about your personal trajectory, which has brought you to where you are in energy finance. And rather than me presenting that, would you like to give us a few highlights of that very briefly to start off with?
Sure, happy to do so. Thanks, Govind. It's great to be speaking with you, and kudos to Amy and Olga for organizing this event. And thanks everyone for tuning in to join here. We look forward, Govind and I, to a good discussion, and it's wonderful to see some familiar names here among the participants. Just scrolling through, I see we have Jim.
It sounds like your headset went out, Reid.
Reid?
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry, your mic sounds like it went out.
Oh, well, that's unfortunate.
We can hear you now.
We can hear you now. We're good.
What about now? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Guys, it's good to, wonderful to speak with everyone, Govind, Amy, Olga, and thanks everyone for joining. I was just reflecting, we look robust attendance list and some familiar names. So Jim Kahan, Jim, you might not, we met Jim we met the night after the economics qualifying exam in the spring of 2006. We were in the audience for Yoram Bauman's performance about sort of his comedy routine, sort of satirizing the 10 principles of microeconomics. It was actually a very rowdy time. Anyhow, so fond memories. And we look forward to engaging with all you guys as we get into the Q&A. So Govind, let me respond, give a little color. I mean, Amy, I think very thankfully gave the sort of snapshot of my professional bio. So I'll briefly add color to that. My career has been focused principally on investing into various forms of clean energy infrastructure. So renewable power generation, electric vehicle charging, et cetera, et cetera. I do that now with our firm LS Power. We're a developer of and investor in various different forms of power generation and related assets. In the case of LS, all in the US. In previous roles at Aligned Climate Capital or Deutsche Asset Management, was doing that work on the more multi-region basis, so in Europe and other areas, and got my start really focused on issues related to energy and climate change while at Reid. And I'll get to that in some of our later discussion. But that is what set me largely on the trajectory that I've been on. As I say, most of it has been focused on investing more into the things that need to be deployed, in order to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions. There's been some work more focused on sort of right sizing, let's say, the amount of investment, into the fossil side, as those two lines sort of cross. But that's in most of my professional work, and happy to elaborate on that as our discussion continues.
Okay, that's fantastic, Reid. Thank you so much. Now, we want to focus this discussion mainly on the question of how do we get from where we are right now to this energy transition in the future to a zero carbon economy. And to do that, the question we really need to answer in this particular panel is, what do we need to pay for to get us there? And number two, how are we going to pay for it? So that's going to be the core of our discussion. But before we get into that, Reid, I wonder if you could kind of lay out for us the landscape of this energy transition as you see it in the coming 10, 20, 30 years, and in particular, how do you see the mix of energy sources, the energy mix around the world shifting from fossil fuels to renewables, perhaps transitioning, though some may not, some who want an absolutely green future may find this abhorrent, perhaps even transitioning for a while through gas and nuclear. How do you see that mix in the next few years, and where do you see most of the action happening?
So, Govind, happy to respond to that. Let me try so we can level set and all, be talking on similar terms, but also just make sure we understand the key parts of the story here before we drill down. And much of this may have been covered in subsequent, in previous panels throughout this sort of climate-themed weekend. But let's just start with a high level, then we drill down. So what we're talking about here, what is the energy transition? I think the energy transition, as I see it, relates principally to transforming our energy system such that we very materially and then almost entirely reduce greenhouse gas emissions that are related with the production and consumption of energy. So we're starting with greenhouse gas emissions, and we care about greenhouse gas emissions, of course, because that is what the main driver of global climate change, right? Currently, in the world, we emit about 51 billion tons of greenhouse gases each year. Okay, so we got 51 billion tons, 34 to 35 billion tons of that, so over 2/3 relates to our energy system. There's an important piece that relates to deforestation and agriculture. That's not going to concern us in this session. We're going to focus on the core piece of it, the 2/3 that relates to energy, right? And the energy system, results in that 34 billion tons of greenhouse gases each year, because at the moment, over about 3/4 of our primary energy and over half of what we call our useful energy comes from the combustion of fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. So we want to go in terms of the trajectory that is the focus of solving and minimizing impacts of climate change. There's a focus on going where we are today to 2020, of that 35 billion tons of greenhouse gases each year. 30 years from now, by 2050, getting to what folks probably on this call will know, the net zero, which is the idea that we may still be using and combusting some degree of fossil fuels, some greenhouse gases, but that will be offset by carbon capture, other things, so that basically we're at zero. That is a dramatic transformation of our energy system that involves, I think of it in four main pillars. And again, we'll go to the details of each one of these, but the four main pillars are as follows, right? You got power generation, you have industry, you have buildings, and then you have transport. So Bill Gates, in his recent climate book, which is quite good, which I definitely recommend if anyone is looking for a book on these topics, breaks it down a little more colloquially into power is how we plug in, right? Industry is how we make stuff, buildings how we live, and transport is how we get around. So the power and the industrial piece of that, those are the most important pieces in terms of share of total emissions, but the buildings and the transport piece still very material. So just to briefly sketch out, how I think about the energy transition, try to boil it down to a digestible fashion. One easy way to think about it is sort of what the end state looks like. The end state looks like a place where the world has become dramatically more efficient in its use of energy. So, and this actually, as an aside, was efficiency in the use of energy, or energy intensity, or energy use per dollar of GDP. That was the focus of my Reid senior thesis. So if anyone is looking for some riveting reading next time you're on campus, stop by the thesis tower, 2007 economics. I guess it's organized by name. Anyhow, you can read all about Canada's Canada's energy trends. Definitely, a good cure for insomnia. But I think it's important work. So we need to be much more efficient in our use of energy, and to try to put some numbers on that. Right, the world currently in terms of how our increases in efficiency, those are currently proceeding at about 1%. Each year, we get about 1% more efficient in our use of energy. We need to quadruple that and be sort of getting at least 4% more efficient in our use of energy each year. And that's across all sectors of the economy. That is not just changing light bulbs, that is changing essentially everything. Not everything, but a large number of things in terms of getting more bang for the buck with the electrons, the molecules we're using. That's kind of plank one, very deep efficiency. Plank two is for power generation, which we'll get back to, and where today most of the discussion and much of the action is. Whereas power generation now globally, over half is from fossil fuels, less than 10% is from wind and solar power. By 2050, we're going to a place where, again, in a net zero scenario, you're going to a place where 90% of power is from renewable sources, probably 70% is from wind and solar, and a very different system than what we have today. How we get there, what that transition looks like, very important. But that's kind of the second piece of it. You got to be very efficient. You're going to have almost entirely zero or very low carbon electricity sources. And then the third piece of it is going to be that you are going to be electrifying large swaths of the economy that do not currently rely on electricity. So, currently we generate electricity, we use that for a variety of things, but for example, transport is not widely electrified at this time. So about totally in terms of sales of vehicles, about less than 5% currently are electric vehicles. You're going to a place, again, in this net zero scenario, where that share is going to sort of 60%, needs to go to 60% by 2030, and then eventually, much higher than that as you get toward 2050. So very efficient, deep efficiency, clean power, a broadly electrified economy. Those are three of the main, not the only, but three of the main planks of what that transition looks like. Govind, to answer your question, and then I'll stop so we can get more engagement. Much of the action today, it focuses principally on, I would say, the second piece, on renewable power generation. So we hear about the dramatic cost declines in wind and in solar, and those are very important parts of the story. And deployment of wind and solar needs to increase dramatically, and by an order of at least 4 times, in terms of annual deployments over the next decade, and likely more. But that is only one part of the story. These other very important parts of the story relating to using energy more efficiently, electrifying more of our economy. We didn't even touch on the industrial piece, which we should discuss separately. But there are other planks to the story, and I think when I think about the energy transition, the most important planks relate not just to deploying more wind and solar, as important as that is, but broadening and touching on these other sectors and finding ways to be deploying new technologies and new assets that can provide the same, cold showers or pardon me, warm showers and cold beer, as we say, but using much less and using much cleaner forms of energy.
Govind, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Reid, for that very general framework for looking at these issues. And I do want to come back to this toward the end and actually play devil's advocate a little bit. But I want to get to the heart of what it is you are going to be telling us in terms of finance. So you've told us where most of the action is going to have to be in this energy transition. And you focused a lot on electrification in particular. Can you tell us, what do we actually need this money for? What exactly are the kinds of investments that we're going to need? And besides the investments in the core infrastructure, the power systems, the transport systems, and so on, can you speak a little bit also about household budgets? How are households on net going to be affected? Because obviously, they're going to be also new cars, electric cars, buildings, and so on. So if you can give us a sense of where the money has to go and how much money are we talking about?
Yeah, certainly. Okay, so let's start. So, Govind, let's do this if we can. Let's start maybe with how much money we are talking about first, and then let's go in terms of what it's going to be funding. So let's, again, to get our orders of magnitude, and is this a big number, is this a small number, right? So currently the world, okay, let's start super globally, right? Our global GDP at the moment is what, 70 or 80 trillion dollars? Right. Is that okay? And if anyone's interested, a fascinating, more academic discussion of the so-called value of everything. My colleague Kerry Krasinski, you can look up the value of everything, which is all financial assets, all real economic activity, probably in the order of about 400 trillion. Okay, it was his estimate. We can debate that, but where does energy fall into that? Right, annual energy investment. I'm talking energy investment of all fossil, renewable, etc. Currently is about $2 trillion a year. Okay, a clean energy investment is at most a quarter of that, and likely less, around the $300 to $400 billion a year, depending on how you tally it. Of that 2 trillion, right? And this is 2020. In a net zero scenario, those numbers, you are taking that let's say $300 to $400 billion of clean energy investment that happened in 2020, and that is by 2030 is up 10 times, right? That has to go towards about $4 trillion a year by 2030, and remain at that level, then probably go down slowly towards 2050. But we're talking kind of a 10x increase over what is currently being invested in clean energy infrastructure. Let's go to your second question now, Govind. What are we talking about? Just we'll tick through the four sectors, right? So power generation, you are talking principally about deploying more, renewable and zero carbon generating plants. So these are wind farms. These are principally wind and solar farms, and then to a lesser extent, hydropower, bioenergy, geothermal, more so-called dispatchable, i.e. you can control them, sources of zero carbon electricity. You need all of that, and then you need to also be very substantially building out, in the US, probably by 2 to 3 times the current transmission network, and building higher and medium voltage transmission lines to be matching where the power is generated to where it's being consumed. So that's in the power sector, right? We're going to industry last because industry is the most complicated in some ways. Let's touch on transport. Transport, you are needing certainly returning to the electrification theme. You're going to need to be deploying a lot for light duty transport, many electric vehicles, and many charging stations to serve those electric vehicles. The charging station piece is one area where our firm is active. But when we're talking the global car fleet, there are currently about 1 billion cars on the road, right? And again, in the net zero scenario, for light duty transport, essentially all of that is going electric, right? So you are needing to be deploying a large number of electric vehicles and electric vehicle transport stations. For other portions of transport, heavy duty transport, longer haul transport, all of that is not necessarily going to be electrified. That is the place where lower carbon fuels or renewable natural gas or hydrogen or other, more energy dense or other forms of low carbon solutions might be the preferred solution. But again, there we're talking about electrolyzers to make hydrogen, or new pipelines to carry hydrogen, new stations to dispense hydrogen, and things of new renewable natural gas stations to be deploying that, similar things. Okay, let's then touch briefly on the other ones. Buildings is a number more efficient devices. So we're talking more efficient light bulbs, more efficient air conditioners, and we're also more efficient chillers And we're also talking for buildings, new forms of providing, for example, the heat to buildings. So instead of burning fuel, if you were having a ground source heat pump system, which depends on where in the country or where in the world you are, but these types of solutions, most of the energy involved in buildings, we're talking about heating and cooling. That's basically what we use. Not forget the electricity piece, because we're counting that separately. That's what we use energy for, to keep buildings, to warm them or to keep them cool. And you got to figure out new ways to do that, without burning a lot of fossil fuel in kind of the net zero scenario. The final piece is industry. And industry is the largest chunk of these four sectors of global greenhouse gas emissions. It is in many ways the most complicated. It is one, again, that Gates talks about a lot. Always one of his 5 sort of questions for climate is, what's your plan for cement? Because cement, the cement industry alone, I think, is maybe 7% of global emissions, and the production of things like cement and steel and plastic, these are very you can't just deploy a bunch of wind farms to try to clean that up, because these are often, in cement, for example, you're using some electricity, fine, but you're also using burning fuel directly to create, process energy for creation of cement. The actual chemical reaction in calcination that creates cement releases greenhouse gas emissions. You need very bespoke solutions for these very important sectors. And there, in some respects there, we're talking about deploying things that may not even fully exist or be commercial yet, but we're talking, about new ways to produce those vital commodities and building blocks really of modern life, without burning, or with burning less of, or with burning in a way that we capture the emissions from, fossil fuels. So hopefully that provides some granularity as to what we're talking about when we're saying clean energy infrastructure and the like.
Yeah, no, thank you. Now, you've thrown some very big, very daunting numbers out there in terms of what levels of investments will be required, what are the kinds of things we need to be paid for. And that's, unsurprising given the, radical kind of transition we're talking about. And in a second, I want to get into how do we actually get that funding? What are the instruments and mechanisms we can use? But before we do that, there's an important piece, because we're still talking about this at a very broad macro level. And I think it is important, and I should probably say this once again to the audience why we're doing this. We're talking about getting to a zero carbon economy. It doesn't matter where those carbon emissions come from, whether it's cattle rearing in Brazil or pollution in Shanghai or Ohio. It's all one planetary system, so we've got to look at it at the global scale. Now, I would like to know from your standpoint, because the modeling that I've seen and a lot of people have talked about over the last 10 years in this transition always includes, because the numbers seem to compel it, some transition use of natural gas and nuclear. Where do you stand on that?
So it's a great question. And here, let me address it, Govind, from a couple of different angles. And the numbers are large. It'll be a massive undertaking. I think one that's very achievable, and one where we start now, even more achievable. But we can get to that. To your question on how we think about this, here's how sort of I think about it. Right, you have two. Okay, let's do nuclear and then let's do fossil fuels. Nuclear. The cop-out answer would be it depends. What kind of nuclear are we talking about? Right, there are current so-called third generation. Let me try to make it simpler. There is certainly a role, I think, for the case for nuclear, as you know, right, it is carbon-free power. It is incredibly energy dense. You don't need a lot of land to do it. And look, countries that France and Nordic countries have very low carbon emissions from the electricity sectors, because decades ago they deployed a ton of nuclear. So that is good for them, and we can all benefit from that. The challenge of nuclear now, today, with the most existing plants, primarily they're very expensive. They are very expensive to build, and that, more than anything, really has held back growth of the nuclear industry, certainly in the developed world, emerging world, somewhat different circumstance. It's that, and then it's the concerns around nuclear waste and proliferation of nuclear weapons. These have been other concerns. I would say that the future of nuclear, certainly it can, in my mind, be part of the solution. It can definitely be part of the solution set, and forms of dispatchable low carbon power. That is partly to get to the fossil point in a second. Part of the reason people remain very focused on nuclear, because a nuclear plant, can either is generating power always around the clock, or can be ramped to generate power when you want, not when you want, as opposed to, for example, wind and solar power, which just inherently, the wind, they produce power when the wind blows or when the sun shines. And there are ways to deal with that. You can add storage, you can aggregate over large areas, but fundamentally, you or I, Governor, you or I can't control if the wind are blowing or the sun shining. But with a nuclear plant, we can turn a dial and produce more or less power. So folks, that has remained focused on that. In my view, there's certainly a role for it. There are no silver bullets here, as Jim Rogers of Duke Energy used to say, only silver buckshot. So there's no indispensable thing. You can get there without it. It probably helps if it's there. The role of nuclear will be greatly abetted if we can commercialize new forms of nuclear power that are cheaper and inherently safer. So, for example, again, not to mention Gates again, he's an investor in a company called Terraform Power, which is commercializing a new kind of reactor. They actually just announced a pilot demonstration in Wyoming. It's not going to come online for 2030, but to the extent we can newer and more advanced forms of nuclear power that are inherently safer and cheaper, that will definitely expand the opportunity set. I'll also say that the future of nuclear, it may not be in the United States. It may be in markets like in China or in India or other parts of the world where demand for power is growing more rapidly. So nuclear, I think they're, role for, but that's where the technological piece really may be helpful. The fossil point here's I think how we think about the fossil piece of it. And again, we need to distinguish between fossil fuel with so-called unabated fossil fuel, so where you're not capturing the CO2, and then if you are fossil fuels in conjunction with CO2 capture. I certainly am of the view that carbon capture, and we can talk on what that means and what that, it can be and ought to be a very vital part of the solution set for addressing climate change. Certainly on industrial applications like steel plants or ethanol facilities or natural gas processing facilities, but also in power generation, right? I mean, there's a reason fossil fuels have played a tremendous role in creating modern life. They've also contributed to climate change, which is not good, but they have been, as Jim Hansen, one of the great climate scientists, said, they've done yeoman work for humanity in helping us raise our standard of living. So with carbon capture, right, you can continue to use them, but not have the CO2 emissions. And that is, again, a focus where our firm has, anyhow, we spend some time. I think the industry is nascent today, needs to grow dramatically, and at scale probably needs to be bigger than today's oil and gas industry, but really needs to grow. The final piece of it on, the transition piece, Govind, your point, the way I think about it is that, yes, fossil fuels, it is very difficult in my mind and in fact impossible to imagine a scenario where you switch off all fossil fuels overnight. Not that you are suggesting that, but certainly in the developed world, where people, as we have come to rely on 24/7, instantaneous, relatively affordable, at least in America, electricity, right? You turn on the switch, you want the switch to be there. And in times where you do that and that does not happen, be that in California this past August, be that in Texas, this past February, people understandably are not happy. So in the developed world, the way I see it, particularly for addressing climate change, whereas fossil fuels produce a majority of our electricity in America today, it is certainly conceivable that number trends downward. But some continued role for, at least in the near and medium term, for dispatchable fossil fuel generation to ensure continued reliability as we transition to a cleaner system, to me is something that is almost essential. I mean, it seems very valuable. It's very hard to imagine it without that. And then in the developing world context, you have a somewhat separate rationale for some, for some presence probably in the transition of fossil fuels. And there's, well, and you probably, I think, can speak very much to this from your work at the World Bank and other places. But there, in many of those places, you don't necessarily have reliable 24/7 electricity. You have a billion people in the world who don't have access to really modern forms of electricity. And understandably, those people want to get access to modern forms of electricity. And renewables can do tremendous things and should be deployed at breakneck speed. But, as helping people in South Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa, sort of ascend the ladder of energy access. Again, that is a place where there likely is some role for fossil fuels in helping that transition occur at the same time as the world is rapidly investing in cleaner forms of generation to be providing, as I said, up in a net zero scenario, 90% of electric power 2050 is coming from those renewable and low carbon sources.
Reid, thank you. I really wish we could double or triple our discussion time because you've provided a very rich set of ideas
Thank you.
there
That's what
that really are worth delving into.
Thank
But
you.
I want to leave the kind of the energy mix set of questions aside for a moment and get into the financing mix and get back to those big numbers that you've thrown out and ask you, how are we going to actually mobilize all of that funding? What kinds of instruments, or what are the sources? What are the private financing
Yes.
sources? What might be government financing sources and
Right.
instruments, regulation, tax incentives, public-private partnerships. And then also, on the kind of the retail household end, what are kinds of the incentives? Now, this is a huge panoply of financing sources and instruments we're talking about. And I know you're only going to be able to cover this at a high level, but I think it's very useful for us to think about, given this huge amount of money you're talking about, what is this going to do
Yeah.
to the way governments raise and spend money and corporations do the same in households?
Yes. How are we going to get the money, Govind? I don't know. How many people do we have? If we pass the hat on this call, how many people do we have? 40, 45 people? We can round up a few shekels likely. No, you're right. It's a daunting task. Here's how I think about it. It is even you're correct. It is a central question in many ways. Unfortunately, many things, not everything, many things do come back to this question of, okay, we need to be investing trillions of dollars a year in order to achieve this. And you will know this well as an economist, I do say investing because it's not, it is inaccurate sometimes, especially if folks are entering these discussions, which you certainly are not, but with more ideological agenda. This is going to cost us X cost.
Mm-hmm.
It's any investment, there's a cost, ideally a cost up front and a benefit going forward. As it is here too. We have to spend money up front to deploy new technologies and transform systems, but then over time we are, paid back, not just by virtue of protecting the Earth's climate and avoiding climate damages, but also often in more readily quantifiable ways. For example, saving on future fuel expenses, right? So if you are, deploying a solar farm and therefore you're not burning diesel to provide some, let's say, off-grid application, right? Then you're not, that fuel savings accrue to you over time. And often these investments can be quite NPV positive, as we say. They can be good investments, but you still need to come up with the money up front, which is still, still a challenge. So that's my first sort of contextual observation. The second contextual observation that I will make, and again, then I will answer your question more directly, is that much of this investment, unquestionably, is going to have to come from private sources. And the key is, how do you put the appropriate incentives or regulations or market signals in place such that you can harness that capital, and sort of harness private investment to be chasing or to be deploying money into these technologies, because we've seen that private markets will respond. Clean energy investment 10 years ago was probably less than 100 billion. Now, as I say, it's 300 or 400 billion. So investors will put money where there's money to be made, but we need to make sure that the rules of the road and the market signals and the prices allow them to make money for helping the planet. Final piece of it, though, is even with that, your point, where is the money going to come from? It's like, in my mind, you break it up. Here are the different sources, right? When we say private capital, right, most private assets, right, are owned by various institutional investors. So these are sovereign wealth funds, these are pension funds, et cetera. And that's, you have, I don't know, $80 trillion, maybe, let's say, of sort of institutional assets that are held by those entities. And that's, again, where we need to be creating the market signals to be making sure that they are deploying. So certainly, where's the money going to come from? Institutional investors, broadly defined, are going to play probably the predominant role in financing this transition. The second piece of it are going to be corporations. Corporations with corporate balance sheets. So these are electric utilities. These are oil and gas companies. These are industrial companies, many of which have played and continue to play and will continue to play leading roles, particularly in certain areas. So many electric utilities have, NextEra and others in Europe have invested, large sums in frankly, as our company, in deploying forms of renewable power generation, areas like carbon capture. Again, Exxon just pledged, I don't know, what do they say they're going to spend? I think at least $1 billion. They're getting to a carbon capture hub they want to create down down in Texas. So corporate balance sheets, institutional investors, corporate balance sheets, governments. Governments certainly need to be a critical participant. It is essential to, I think, focus government capital where it is most appropriately used. So ideally not crowding out or competing with, but catalyzing more private investment. So we know that at earlier stage R&D investment is a tremendous place for government dollars because it's very hard to get private capital to fund true R&D. The incentives aren't fully aligned. R&D is a wonderful place. Helping de-risk deployment of newer technologies and loan guarantees and green banks and these type of things are another tremendous area, for government investment. But clearly, governments have a tremendous role to play, and with with real interest rates, at this time in this country, negative or almost negative, there's a good case to be made. Now it's a good time for governments to be investing. Final piece with the household piece you mentioned is in some ways the most challenging. I mean, households certainly have a role to play in this. Many are doing that directly by virtue of retrofitting homes or putting up solar panels or things like this. In my mind, the key thing, households, it's like you need to be. This is again touches back to one of my earlier points of why I think managing a transition and maintaining reliability is so important, because you need to be making sure that this transition is financed in such a way that doesn't overly burden household budgets at any time, and therefore create blowback. So, households, I think, are going to be fundamentally participating in this by virtue of, in some cases, changing how they pay their utility bills or how they pay their gas bills. But nonetheless, will be affected by all these forces, and managing that and making sure that it's sort of done in a measured way is quite important.
Thanks, Reid, for that financing piece. Now, I want to go back to your earlier, landscape, laying out the landscape, and I want to play a bit of a devil's advocate here. I want to sort of try and speak on behalf of well-informed global citizens who may not be observing financial markets every day or even interested in this. They're just concerned that things may have already gotten, too far. And we may never be able to get on the trajectory, where we avert this 2-degree rise in average temperatures that the International Panel on Climate Change keeps talking about. That in a sense it's really too late, and that the only difference that finance can make will really be at the margin for a whole set of investments. But at a macro level, the window, if not has closed, is closing really too fast. Okay, that's a somewhat pessimistic view. It's not an entirely unrealistic view, given all of the findings and the uncertainties that have been reported on lately in the scientific and other community. How do you react to that? I mean, you're in this business for day in and day out. You hear this, you hear the imperative of, getting out the financing, creating the incentives, and so on. So how do you react to this more kind of pessimistic outlook, which is not necessarily unrealistic?
So Govind, I think you've gone native on us. You're spending too much time in the UK over there. We're Americans, Govind. Okay, come on. We are optimistic. We're going to get it done. We're not. No, I'm kidding. So it's a very valid question, and let me share a few observations. The first, just the technical piece, and I think this, and I should have put this in our comment. 2 degrees, even 2 degrees, getting there, that's still a lot of effect on our climate. Really now 1.5 or less is sort of the goal of the day. So even if 2 degrees centigrade, that's still substantial effect. Maybe not for those of us living in, Cambridge or Portland or New York, but yes, but the rest of us still. So here's how I would add, Fred. Let's break it down. Kind of like, are we too screwed to care? One. And then if not, what role does finance have to play in that? So are we too screwed to care? It is a very daunting, I think, question, and one that even either explicitly, and I like you just phrased it bluntly, or just implicitly, of us just getting discouraged and being like, forget it, and there's just slowly is the greatest risk, I think, the most important risk. Inertia is the biggest enemy of getting any of this done, not fossil fuel interest, not just inertia, the system just being able to change from our current path. So I think to me the rejoinder to that, And you are correct that our current trajectory, we want to be shooting for 1.5 or less in terms of degrees centigrade over our pre-industrial, over sort of our current climate. We are already headed for sort of 3 to 4 degrees, right? Not good. We want to be hitting 1.5 or less. But to me, there's no point at which action on climate does not become important, because 3 degrees is a lot better than 4 degrees. 4 degrees a lot better than 5 degrees. 5 degrees a lot better than 6 degrees. The damage function never stops and maybe becomes exponential at some point. If you model out the just total catastrophe scenario, if we were to dig up and burn in an unabated way all fossil fuels on the earth, we're getting to sort of, maybe 16 degrees Celsius of warming. That wouldn't really, it's hard to even fathom. That is just it becomes entirely uninhabitable for anyone, right? The scenarios become so dire as you go into these really more sort of tail outcomes, that there's, even if we're not going to hit 1.5, even if we're not going to hit 2, even if we're not going to hit 3, there is, in my mind, there was never a case for not trying to hit something and not trying to do better than whatever the business as usual scenario is. Because once you get into these higher temperature impact scenarios, things become just almost unfathomable. So that's point one. I think then point two on the finance piece is the margins. As we go on, as you indicated early on in this discussion, capital is one essential component of enabling the energy transition. Not the only one. You need a lot of things other than capital, but capital, money, we're talking trillions of dollars, right? So we're talking about clean energy investment going from 300 to 400 billion now to 4 trillion by 2030. That is essential and that is needed. So to me, it's a critical piece. To put a little bit of a different spin on it, to me, one of the more, at least as a practitioner, as in a day in, day out, that in some ways the more troubling, or at times the more troubling question is one of, can you imagine a scenario where clean energy investment rises, folks in it, ideally, knock on wood, manage to do very well. We make a lot of money, but we don't really bend the curve on emissions. We don't really make a big impact on climate, right? And that's why, in my view, folks who are out there continually trying to raise the level of ambition and have us do more and start now, do more sooner are so important.
Okay, listen, in 40, I haven't kept track of our time. I think we have hit our 40 or 45 minutes mark, Jim. You have turned on a big fire hose of ideas and knowledge on really huge issues that could take us several days. Thank you very much. I really want us to now be able to open ourselves up to the audience. There are many questions we haven't touched on, inequality within countries, across countries, how do we address that as part of, the financing aspect of this problem. There are also some important questions of where technology is going and how that affects the financing piece. But let me sort of stop here and hand it back over to Amy and find out what we have in our pipeline of questions.
All right, and keep the questions coming. I'm going to get started. I think some of this may have been addressed after the question was posed, but I'm going to put it out there again. Jim Kahn says, question regarding not using carbon-based fuels. Is there a possible role, perhaps temporarily, for nuclear-based energy? If you want to elaborate a little bit on maybe more than what you said earlier about nuclear.
Sure, Jim, and thank you for the question. And I'd be curious for your and others' views on this topic. So look, nuclear, today in the US, right, nuclear is about 20% of our electricity supply and definitely the predominant source of zero carbon electricity. So it is not nothing. And I think that the key in my mind, there's sort of two keys. One is existing, there are actually two keys. There are two issues. One issue is existing nuclear generation in largely developed markets that is now in some cases becoming uneconomical because power prices are lower and a variety of other issues. What happens with that? Should that be kept around or not? People have different views on this. That's sort of one view. The more interesting question to me, though, is some of these newer forms of nuclear power, be it Gates' company or other people that are trying to commercialize, cheaper, inherently safer forms of nuclear power, and that to me could be very interesting, right? Again, it's going to be a while. This is not overnight stuff. This is really sort of 2030 is when you would begin to see these new reactors deployed. But if either much smaller reactors, safer reactors, if those can prove commercial, then I think and you have a new dispatchable form of zero carbon electricity, that's potentially very interesting. I think we're certainly not there today. But it's interesting, and that's why, again, Gates and others are willing to pour billions of dollars into it.
Thank you. So this is a question I think you addressed to a little bit that there may be a role. It's not just expecting the markets to fix things, but we may need to have government intervention. But Allison Groves, class of 1999, says, I have a hybrid, but like most workers in this country can't afford a Tesla. The average worker cannot afford my hybrid. What is the plan to make electric vehicles affordable to the masses? Yeah. Is it expected that as the technology improves, the prices will just drop? And I think this could apply to a lot of different technologies.
Definitely, which is a great question, and has been, one of the key and one of the underappreciated, I think, barriers to wider acceptance of light duty electric vehicles. The sticker point that you mentioned. I went through someone took me through the numbers the other day of I forget, but a Tesla, even the Model 3 is what, maybe $30,000 or $35,000, depends on what features and but the average sort of ICE or internal combustion engine car is like 20 maybe. So there's a cost delta. I think in my mind there are two things. One is that yes, prices for electric vehicles are expected to continue to decline as a result, and there are various headwinds to this that we can talk about of interest, but as a result principally of just scaling up of production. Right. And if there's sort of a virtuous cycle when you're producing on a larger scale, then the cost per unit of what you're producing tends to come down. And not just as Tesla is ramping up, but as all of the other automakers are all getting into the act, that is just a base of production for electric vehicles becomes dramatically larger. And that is expected to drive reductions, not just in the cost of the battery, which battery prices have come down very dramatically or expected to continue to do so, but in other components as well. That scale up is expected to help drive reductions in cost. And then the second piece of it, I'll say, is that you expect to drive reductions in cost to the point where by 2025, maybe 2025, 2030, we're expected to be at a place where there is so-called sort of sticker price parity between electric or hybrid vehicles and internal combustion engine vehicles. Many of the former already are cheaper today on a life cycle basis, but as you indicated, upfront costs still matter. And so, costs are expected to come down. Even with sticker price parity, there are still other issues and range anxiety and where can I charge that need to be addressed and are being addressed. But that would be that is the expectation that of what is what is going to occur. But it's a very important question.
Thank you. We have a question. The transition for vehicles cannot be instantaneous. How do we manage that?
Yeah. So, right. I agree with you. It is not instantaneous. Is hard, right? Let's just talk about why it's hard, and then try to talk about why I can get it done. It's hard for a couple of reasons. It's hard because here are the reasons it's really hard, right? And we're just talking here. I'm just going to answer this. And who asked the question, Amy? May I ask you?
Oh yeah, sorry. It was Jim Kahn.
Jim again, back at it. Okay. So Jim, here it is very hard. And I'm just going to talk about light duty. We're not even talking about heavy duty and planes and things that really are more resistant to electrification and require other solutions. And we can talk about those, and those are very important. But even light duty, why is it hard? It's hard, right? Because here are three reasons at least why it's hard. Talking about cars. It's hard because there are a billion cars on the road. It's hard because people are keeping their car, at least in the US, keeping their cars longer than they used to. So there's less turnover. And then it's hard because, at least globally speaking, people, the SUV, like it or not, especially in, from our Portland roots and Portland, like it or not, the SUV, many countries, most of the world, is becoming like the default model of choice. People, that is the fastest growing segment of vehicle sales by far, which obviously is a challenge. But bigger cars use more fuel, harder to electrify. So it doesn't happen overnight, no question. I think the key to making it happen more quickly, right, and getting to a place where, again, globally now you have 5% of vehicle sales that are electric, getting that to 60% by 2030 is you certainly need to have the declining vehicle costs that we talked about in the answer to Allison's question in cheaper vehicles. You need to have the infrastructure in place to enable people to use those vehicles efficiently. And that's principally the charging infrastructure. Dramatic increase in charging infrastructure needs to happen. Unfortunately, that's been one of the focus of President Biden's infrastructure plans. And then finally, the other market incentives and regulations in place to try to move vehicle fleets to be cleaner, and things like the low carbon fuel standard in California or similar policies elsewhere. It definitely doesn't happen overnight, but to me, it's like you got the hardware piece, you got the charging infrastructure piece, then the regulatory piece, all need to be working in concert to try to accelerate the pace at which that transition occurs.
Thank you. Mark McLean, class of 1970, says, electrons are far cheaper than hydrocarbon molecules. Can the long-term savings be used to offset the upfront costs of purchasing an electric car?
Yeah, so short answer is yes. I think it varies as someone, I'm sure. Thank you for the question, Mark. I'm sure probably everyone, unless they're a Reid person, very smart on this call. Short answer is yes. Even in the United States, right, where molecules actually are relatively cheap relative to Europe, for example, or they're taxed at a much higher rate. The payback on an electric vehicle, and don't quote me, but it's depending on how much you drive and what car you buy, it's not outrageous. So there is I think the case for lower life cycle cost of ownership, which you're getting at, is there and is robust and is going to get more robust. The key is now it's like for people who are not solely, for whom that is not enough of a motivator to buy, how do you bring the upfront costs down or enable them to get better use out of the car with more charging and other things? But no, that's the key thing. And that is the key thing with, let me just to stop for a sec. That applies not just to vehicles, but to many aspects of the energy transition. We're talking in many cases here about, trading CapEx for OpEx. So technologies like solar, for example, as well, that have a higher per kilowatt capital cost often. Solar actually has come down a lot, but more upfront investment, but then the fuel is free or the operating costs are lower. And that's the beauty of it, right? And that's why long-term it can be a very good place. The key is we got to just get the capital now to be building the stuff and buying the stuff.
Thank you. Liam Noel, I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name correctly. I apologize if I'm not. Do you agree that in the end, electrification, net zero future is more economically efficient? Southern Cal Edison's recent paper indicates that the total bill to customers is lower due to increased efficiency of electric engines. Nice,
so good, Liam. Good, you sound like a specialist. Go to SoCal Ed. Quite interesting. They'll look you up, see what you do after this call. So short answer is yes, I do believe that's the case, because I do believe that's the case. That we'll be saving a lot on fuel expenses, avoiding climate damage. I certainly believe it's the case. Then and that's good, right? And that's should embolden people for wanting to get to that place and to move quickly to get there. The counterpoint, to spout another cliche, the Keynes point, in the long run, we're all dead. So it's like long and really a series of short runs. So how do we navigate these short runs appropriately? But yes, I think it is an important point. How that should not be lost sight of, and that should be mentioned more. And the key is then just how do you navigate those short runs, and then how do you manage some of these distributional issues that come with, even as more efficient, if we're going to be deploying a lot more people doing one thing, a lot less people doing the other thing, how do we help those latter people, during that transition period? But I do agree with that. I think it's, we can head to a very, very good place. We can make sure that we're getting there the right way and getting there quickly enough.
I have a question, Reid. I'm
Sure.
going to try to articulate as well as I can. So from what I've observed, a lot of renewable technology, sustainable businesses are really at the mercy of who's in power, and at least in the United States, in our government, who's in charge of Congress, who's in the White House. So there's a real disruption every time we have a change in power, and that's really hindered the deployment and the development of these technologies. So at what point do you see a market becoming kind of self-sufficient and not as much at the mercy of who's in power?
Yeah. So it's a very good question. And probably shaped to some extent. I can't recall, Amy. Do you work with no, not Enel. You worked at Iberdrola. You spent time with them, or
I was there briefly. I did
okay.
carbon and water footprinting for Cascade Energy here in Portland for a while. So
got it. Okay, yeah. Understood. Thank you. So I would let me agree and then disagree and give the counterpoint to. I agree that yes. Where do I agree with that statement? I agree with that statement in that historically and even now, right, there are certain segments of the clean energy universe that have been strongly buffeted by the presence or absence of regulatory incentives. So this would certainly, the history of the wind industry with the production tax credit. And if you're interested in Google, sort of history of US wind deployments, and you see sort of the sawtooth pattern, depending on when the PTC has been extended, not extended. The biofuels industry with a blender's tax credit or with the renewable fuel standard program. Again, there's been volatility. And I think so that's where I agree. I would disagree in the sense that I think many of these, I would disagree in sort of a couple ways, or at least try to complicate your answer, that many of these industries, despite some of the historical reliance, have proven very resilient. And wind, the wind industry is still here, right? And is still, I think, even if the PTC were to go away, is still going to be here. That segments is certainly true for many segments of the biofuels industry. So I think that there has been actually a tremendous amount of progress with having, as technology costs have come down, as things have gained greater acceptance, with getting things to be more commercial, more self-sustaining. The other piece I'll mention is on the regulatory piece is that it's not, I agree with you, regulation still does and will continue to matter. It is, as I think it is not just a federal question. There are the federal government, things like tax credits, and for things like, biofuels often play a very important role, but state policies, particularly, in the power sector, state renewable portfolio standards, or other state level incentives really can be California with the low carbon fuel standard, irrespective of what's happening in Washington, have proven very powerful drivers of new activity. So, to me, it's a hard question to answer because it varies by industry. There's no simple answer. I think it's that, to me, is that when I look at this just as an investor, often gain confidence in sort of recognizing a variety of regulatory drivers for many industries, not just a single one, no single point of failure, but also that over time, again, as technology costs have come down, as business models have become more refined, industries have proven an ability to be able to adapt, to be able to continue to grow even amid regulatory headwinds.
Thank you. A question from Rachel Fredericks, class of 2004. Do you have advice for the best ways to pressure the decision makers at the institutional investment level to divest from fossil fuels? I recently ran a somewhat successful campaign at my university to allow us individually to invest the employer contributions to our retirement savings accounts in a low carbon mutual fund for the first time, but I'm looking for advice about next steps.
So I appreciate, Rachel, I do appreciate the question. It is not, I must say, it is not, let me say what I can. It is not an area that is organizing, and it is not an area in which I necessarily am going to be the most authoritative person to answer. You probably have other people on this call or on this weekend who have more experience organizing or doing things that could speak just much more knowledgeably to that particular question. So I may sort of punt. I may punt to partially on that. What I would say to you, and I will also sort of not punt, but I will. The question of, well, I'll punt. Here's what I think where folks have gotten and having engaged to speak to work that I have been involved with on the institutional investor side, for example. I think institutional investors, particularly now, and Govind mentioned at the start, this was on sort of the corporate shareholder resolution side, but whereas 5 years ago, certainly 10 years ago, right? This climate stuff, this ESG stuff, is this like fly on the wall? What is this stuff? Is this fake? Is this what? like everyone recognizes this stuff is real now, right? Everyone knows this is real. And everyone is, whether you're a college endowment, whether you are a pension fund in Europe, whether you're an oil and gas company in Texas, right? Everyone is, that I deal with at least, and I don't deal with everyone, but everyone I deal with and everyone I read about is seeking, what is my role in this energy transition? How do I continue to be profitable? How do I continue to be impactful? What am I doing, right? And to the extent that you can help institutional investors, I think, recognize the opportunities to be had in financing the energy transition. And that's work that I have had some exposure to. The Clean Trillion Initiative board, feel free to Google, is an effort that I worked on some years ago in this vein. But you know, the opportunities to be had in financing energy transition, and then also some of the, for different investors, depending on their portfolios, some of the risks that they were exposed to, right? If they do not adapt or sort of take into consideration many of these trends, I think that there is a receptivity to that, and it's something that, you know, is worth is worth continuing to advocate and to engage in dialogue on, because again, the wheel really is turning, and the conversations that at least I observe has gone from, is this real or not? Should I care or not? To, okay, what is my strategy? What am I going to do? So I think anyone who cares about these issues is well positioned to, you know, get a good audience.
Thank you, Reid. Let's see. It says it looks like Govind says he has a closing question that he'd like to ask. So, Govind, I'm going to turn it over to you. Oh, Govind, you are muted again.
Oh, okay. I'm assuming therefore that we're approaching. I'm not keeping track of time here. The closing, and I've been getting a few messages, and I'm going to try and reconstruct this a little bit. Reid, you know, some of us, some people in power today have the power to make decisions, have the power to make spending decisions, and there are also all the large number of future beneficiaries of any energy policies we decide on today, many of whom are unborn or not in that same position of power. What I'm asking is, do you, when you look at the future in macro terms, and when you look at where you mentioned interest rates are very low, are we actually valuing the future sufficiently today? This is the caring question. Or some people say this is the discount function question. This may not be your bailiwick. But when you look at these numbers, you must get a sense of whether the costs are shifting fast enough, the cost of the technologies and products, and whether the cost of the financing are favorable enough that we can actually make this big push, you know, toward the several $1 trillion, you know, per year investments you're talking about. What's your gut sense? What are you feeling every day?
Govind, tell me, can you repeat the question slightly? I want to make sure I answer it properly here. I feel I didn't quite get. Tell me, just put it to me again, would you, so I make sure I'm getting it properly.
Very basically, are we as decision makers, are we as investors, people who have access to money, are we valuing the future enough to get to the zero energy future?
Okay, that's a difficult, right? So talking discount rates and pure time value of money and all this.
Right.
I mean, okay.
Yes, exactly.
The answer is probably almost certainly not. The problem is it's a somewhat subjective question, right? In the sense that interpersonal utility and rate of time prep, all these things, brain damage. I don't want to relive this. So here's a point. I think that it is, I would say, my personal view. This is as everything I've said here on the call is all my personal view, but including this one in particular, it does seem to me that we as humans, certainly myself are concluded, we have a tremendous talent for ignoring or for discounting the future. Sometimes that's good. And if you knew it was coming in certain things, you would never do them. And so I don't want to, but it is, are we valuing the future enough? I would say that the challenges are, one, even on a personal level, right? Just even if you were dictator, you were king, right? We, I don't know that we are fully attuned and focused on the future. And it's difficult in a situation of climate change where we are dealing with things that are hard to quantify, that are in some cases have not happened before. So that's a challenge, right? And one that needs to be on guard and figure out how to counteract. I think the other analog to that you're getting at, right, is like decision makers, be they corporate decision makers, certainly political decision makers. Are there incentives? Are they incentivized to care about the long term, or they're incentivized to just care about, look, I'm going to be doing this. I'm going to be out of here. And my election cycle is 2 years, right? So if I have the next 2 years, I don't care. Don't bother me with that, right? And that is really a challenge. And I think if you have that question of like, how do we incentivize people to be and hold people accountable, right? To be caring, yes, not just what is going to be happening a long time from now, but also now is important. The final thing I'll say, per your point, is that it is, and this is not, you don't want these things to happen, right? But it is instructive, at least, and maybe it's changing the dialogue, that climate impacts, right? Again, whereas certainly 10 years ago, we could say, oh, none of this is happening. Each day in the Times or any whatever paper you read, there seems to be new documentation of being able to say impacts today, be they heat waves, be they droughts, be they, some connection to climate change, right? Certainly on the West Coast, folks at Reid will know this. So to me, it's like the long term, that's where most of the impacts are, but we're feeling even today now. So the conversation seems to become more timely, and hopefully will be, again, it's not something you would wish for, but like it's somewhat of an antidote to the sort of mode of thinking that I think you correctly reference.
Very good. Well, Reid, listen, thank you for putting us on that really honest, I think, wavelength about where we are and what certainty or uncertainty we have towards certain things, but yet how morally or ethically we need to still think about our positioning with respect to all of this, regardless. Okay, that's a big piece. Olga, shall I hand it back to you?
I'll take over. Thank you, Govind. And thank you, Reid, so much for this exciting discussion.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Govind. Thank you, Amy and Olga. Go ahead.
Yeah, finance economics, our transition to a net zero energy future. It's daunting, but I have been encouraged by some things that I've seen happening in the news, and I'm encouraged to hear from someone who works in the industry about what's happening and where they see things going. So thank you so much. And thank you all for your great questions in the Q&A. This is the end of this session. Coming up at